They always said that if the Allies ever returned to France, Germany would know instantly. The Atlantic Wall was supposed to be impenetrable. Every bunker, every gun position, every mile of coastline was built around a single idea. If the enemy came, they would be thrown back into the sea within hours. That illusion shattered at dawn on June 6, 1944. And deep inside the German command network, the conversations that morning were nothing like the myth of a confident, disciplined Reich. They were chaotic, panicked, desperate, and full of moments that showed they knew, almost from the start, that D-Day was spiraling beyond their control. The first signs didn't come from Normandy at all. They came from radar stations up and down the French coast. Operators were staring at screens that suddenly lit up with massive blurs, shapes so large they looked like storms, not ships or planes. But they weren't storms. They were thousands of Allied aircraft towing gliders, dropping paratroopers, jamming frequencies, and clouding the airwaves. Officers rushed to wind up telephone lines, shouting for confirmation. Some believed the screens were malfunctioning. Others insisted it was the real thing. The confusion was immediate, and it set the tone for the entire day. At around 3 a.m., the German 7th Army headquarters received its first urgent messages: enemy landings detected. But even then, they didn't know what they were dealing with. For 2 years, German intelligence had warned of a coming invasion, but they were convinced it would strike at Calais, the shortest distance between Britain and France. Normandy was considered a diversion at best. So when the first reports came in, many officers assumed it was a feint, a probe, a test they could quickly contain. What they didn't know was that the Allies had spent months feeding false information to their spies, running fake radio traffic, and deploying inflatable tanks around southeast England to trick Germany into believing Calais was the real target. Hitler himself believed Normandy was too obvious, too open, too narrow. The deception worked so well that even as the first Allied troops splashed into the surf, the German high command still refused to fully accept what they were seeing. By 5 a.m., the German coastal batteries at Utah and Omaha were sending frantic messages. They were under massive naval fire they couldn't match. Shells bigger than cars were hitting bunkers, shaking the ground so violently that sand poured from ceilings and trenches collapsed. A battery commander at Pointe du Hoc shouted over the noise that the horizon looked like it was on fire. One officer said he couldn't even see the ocean anymore, just smoke and shadows of ships. But the worst message came shortly after. We are being overrun. Inside the 7th Army headquarters, General Friedrich Dollmann was still struggling to get permission to release armored divisions. Under German command structure, only one man could release the panzers for a counterattack: Adolf Hitler. And at the moment the invasion was unfolding, Hitler was asleep. His staff refused to wake him. They had been trained to never disturb him unless absolutely necessary. So as the Allies stormed the beaches, Germany's most powerful units sat idle, engines cold, crews waiting in barracks, because nobody dared to pick up the phone and wake the Führer. Around 6 a.m., phone lines began flooding with calls from sector commanders. Many were speaking so quickly and with so much panic that their messages overlapped. Reports of paratroopers dropping behind the lines were pouring in. The airborne landings were so scattered that German units couldn't piece together what was happening. Some towns reported hundreds of enemy soldiers. Others reported none. Some claimed they were surrounded. Others insisted the landings were fake. Officers tried to draw maps, but the situation changed faster than they could write. One of the most telling moments came when General von Rundstedt, the commander of all German forces in Western Europe, asked bluntly, "Where is the main attack?" No one could answer. That question, simple, obvious, revealed just how blind the German command really was. The Allies had achieved complete surprise, not because Germany wasn't expecting an invasion, but because they were expecting it somewhere else. By 7 a.m., the messages from Omaha Beach became impossible to ignore. German units reported they were inflicting heavy losses, but they also admitted something alarming. The enemy wasn't stopping. Waves kept coming, one after another. Every time the Germans thought they had pushed the Allies back, Another wave landed. Machine gun crews shouted that their barrels were overheating. Mortar teams reported they were nearly out of shells. One officer radioed in disbelief. "They just keep coming." In the headquarters, the realization hit hard. The Allies weren't testing the defenses. They weren't probing. This was the invasion. A commander reportedly muttered, "If they hold the beaches by midday, we lose France." It wasn't a dramatic line. It was a cold assessment. German strategy depended entirely on throwing the enemy back into the sea within hours. The Atlantic Wall was never designed to stop an invasion indefinitely. It was designed to stop the first wave long enough for the panzers to arrive. But the panzers still hadn't received permission to move. The turning point came just after 8 a.m., when Field Marshal Rommel's chief of staff attempted to call him. Rommel was not at headquarters. He was in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday. He believed the weather was too bad for an invasion. He wasn't expected back for hours. So the man Germany trusted most to repel an invasion wasn't even in France when it happened. Inside the command room, officers were flipping through maps, placing pins on locations where American, British, and Canadian forces had landed. The board began filling up so quickly that one officer reportedly said, "This can't all be real." They expected one landing, maybe two. Instead, there were 5. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Dozens of reports were coming in that they simply didn't have the manpower to cover all of them. Around 8:30 a.m., the German 352nd Infantry Division, responsible for Omaha Beach, sent a chilling message. "We cannot hold." This was the moment German command began to understand the truth. Omaha was supposed to be the toughest beach. The cliffs, the bunkers, the minefields, everything favored the defenders. Yet the Allies were breaking through. Shortly after 9 a.m., Hitler was finally awakened and told an invasion was underway. He refused to believe Normandy was the main target. He insisted the real attack would come at Calais and that Normandy was a distraction. As a result, he refused to release the full armored reserves. Only a portion of the panzers were allowed to move, and by the time they reached firing positions, the Allies had already established footholds. Meanwhile, at 7th Army headquarters, officers knew they were losing control. Communication lines were failing. Some cables had been cut by paratroopers. Others were destroyed by naval bombardment. Orders couldn't reach frontline units. The entire command structure was collapsing. One officer told Rundstedt, "We must push them back by noon, or the war is lost in the West." Rundstedt didn't argue. He simply said, "Then the war is lost." That sentence echoed through the command center, not because it was dramatic, but because Rundstedt was the highest-ranking officer on the Western Front, and he was admitting defeat even as the battle raged. By early afternoon, the panzers that had been released finally began moving, but they ran into a problem no one expected: Allied air control. The skies were swarming with Allied fighters and bombers. Convoys couldn't move without being strafed. Tank columns were forced to hide in forests, move only at night, or take back roads. It became obvious that counterattacks wouldn't arrive in time. Around 3 p.m., German observers at the cliffs above Omaha reported that Allied troops had broken through the last defensive line and were pushing inland. The beach was no longer a beach, it was a supply zone. Hundreds of ships were unloading tanks, jeeps, artillery, and thousands of soldiers. One officer stared through binoculars and said quietly, "They are building a city." By evening, every German commander on the front lines knew the day was lost. They weren't just fighting soldiers, they were fighting a machine. The Allies had logistics, air power, naval dominance, and overwhelming manpower. The Germans were outnumbered, outgunned, isolated, and confused. In the command headquarters, the final realization came when reports confirmed the Allied airborne troops had linked up with beach forces. This meant the invasion force was now unified. There was no longer a gap to exploit, no way to split them apart, no way to push them back. A colonel is said to have whispered, "Normandy is the beginning of the end." Another officer, exhausted and covered in dust from collapsing walls, simply said, "We cannot stop them." Late that night, Rundstedt made one last call. To Hitler's headquarters, he requested full authority to pull back, reorganize, and launch a coordinated counteroffensive. But he was denied. Hitler ordered the forces to hold their current positions at all costs. That decision sealed the fate of the German army in the West. When the sun rose on June 7th, the impossible had happened. Germany had failed to stop the invasion on the first day, and every German officer knew what that meant. The Atlantic Wall, the project they spent years building, the line that was supposed to protect Europe, had fallen in less than 24 hours. In private conversations recorded later, German officers admitted they realized the war was effectively unwinnable from that moment. They didn't say it publicly, they couldn't, but they said it among themselves. One general described D-Day in 6 words that summarize the entire German command reaction. It could not be stopped anymore.